The title of today's talk is in two parts. Listening to the shepherd's voice, you would have started picking up this idea of our theme for today on the shepherd. How many of you guys have heard of the word Tahiti? And you can maybe put up your hands if you've heard of Tahiti. Not everybody. Not everyone's heard. Anyone want to tell us what it is? Nick?
Island in the Pacific Ocean.
Yep, it's part of French Polynesia, and the particular island, Tahiti, is that little figure-eight island there. It's a wonderful vacation destination, beautiful beaches, nice place probably to snorkel and dive, and a really great place to go and spend a vacation. What about Tuamotu? A little bit more. Anyone heard of Tuamotu? Yeah, pretty close. Yeah, he's getting good. Tuamotu, also part of that same area. It's basically a bunch of about 80 islands and atolls in that southern Pacific. And you can see, again, from the picture on the right, beautiful beaches, beautiful place to go to for a holiday. What about Teahupu? Anyone heard of Teahupu? Where's David? David, I would have thought would have known this. Teahupu? Huh? Okay, Teahupu, in fact, is more famous for its surf spot, its waves. As you can see, unbelievably ferocious waves. I mean, you look at the size of that lip, that is just tons and tons of water coming over there. So not for the faint-hearted and not for the unskilled. But it's actually a town in that Tahiti, but it's more famous for that particular wave. And it gets up to 7 meters. And the reason it's so fat and big is because there's a coral reef that lies just lurking under that water. So if you get wiped out on there, goodbye when you hit that coral reef. And then the next one, our last one, Tohu Bohu. Anyone heard of Tohu Bohu?
Yes.
You've heard of it? Good. Before you jump in, let me take everybody through it. Anybody else heard of Tohu Bohu besides Nick? Okay, so every one of you would have read it, but the only problem is, unfortunately, you read it in English, so you wouldn't have actually seen the Hebrew of Tohu Bohu. And which book do you think it first occurs in the Bible? Genesis. See, always we can go to Genesis. I mean, that's always a good bet. Head down to Genesis. What about the chapter? Chapter 1. Always a good idea to just keep going back to the beginning. So, chapter 1. What about the verse? No, not a bad direction, but no. So there was always a little twist in that one. So, and in fact occurs in verse 2. So if you've got your Bibles on your laps or on your phone, have a look up verse 2, and let's see, maybe one of the young ones, if they could, find those words that make up Tohu Bohu. And not too difficult, because there's not a lot to sort of choose from there. So I don't know if anyone's turned it up. And have a look at what you think is Tohu Bohu. It's actually Tohu Bohu, and we'll get to why that is the case. But the two Hebrew words, Tohu and Bohu, something you can't forget. I mean, two simple little words. Anyone want to have a hazard? What it is?
Rebecca will put her hand up.
Yeah. Come, Rebecca.
She whispered in my ear.
Yeah. What did she whisper?
She said, form and void.
Yeah, it's actually without form and void. Okay, so it's those four, or if you ignore the and, without form and void. But again, it's all coming down to translations. So without form and void is Tohu Bohu. And we read it there in verse 2, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So Genesis 1 verse 2. And when we go and look at the Strong's number, Strong's 8414, which is translated as we see in this particular translation, without form, we'll see that it has a range of translations throughout the Old Testament: formlessness, confusion, emptiness, wasteland, wilderness, chaos, a whole bunch of these different kind of concepts that they've decided upon. Likewise, if we go to Bohu, Bohu translated emptiness, void, and waste. And so, again, they're quite similar to each other in a way. And as I said before, when these two words are are brought together. They have this Hebrew connective, and we find them here occurring as Tohu Bohu, and whether you've got that little W with the apostrophe or a W-A. So Tohu Bohu. And if we go and look at the, say, just two different translations, King James and NIV, the earth was without form and void, which is what Rebecca had there. The NIV, the earth was formless and empty. So again, it's this formless or empty. And again, just looking at it, that without form or formless is the tohu, and the void or empty is the bohu. And when we look at tohu on its own, we find tohu occurs in the Old Testament 20 times. And that's a list of on that table of where tohu occurs. Bohu, on the other hand, only occurs 3 times in the whole Old Testament, and it always occurs in conjunction with tohu. So you won't find bohu on its own. It has to live with tohu. Most often it's tohu wa bohu, or at least 2 cases, but sometimes it can be slightly separated within the verse, but obviously they are linked together. So looking at that table that's up there and how the ESV and the King James have translated the 20 uses of tohu, we can see, as I said before, how much it varies in terms of the translation. But the general feeling when you look through those different words in that is really one of sort of emptiness and almost kind of nothingness in a way. And what's interesting about Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2, saying that the earth, what it's really trying to say to us is that the earth itself materially existed. And we understand that's true because when we go to verse 1 of Genesis chapter 1, God tells us in the beginning He created the heavens and the earth. So He already created the earth prior to verse 2. So the earth already existed, but functionally it was non-existent. And so Genesis, especially chapter 1, is very much about the why God created things and not the how. God wasn't interested in trying to explain to Moses and people 3,500 years ago, nor was He, quite frankly, interested in explaining to us how He went about it. I don't think we have the ability to conceive or understand or grasp how God went about creating the how. But what He is interested in is giving to us the why He created these things. And so what we're being told here in verse 2 is that the earth was functionally there. Was non-functionally there, but materially there. So it was not yet functioning within an ordered structure or system. The functionality of that system, in this case, not being from God's perspective. God doesn't need this thing to function for Himself. That's not why He created it. He created it rather for man. And so that after functionality is established by God as we go through those verses in chapter 1, it is for man's good and well-being that this functionality is brought about upon the earth. And so throughout Genesis chapter 1, when God says that at the end of each activity, and we see that in those various verses that I've listed there, that it is good. What God is doing here is confirming or affirming that it was functioning properly for the benefit of man. And hopefully I've sort of tried to get that idea across to you. This is all about functionality and not just about the material existence. And so this idea leads to the concept that the pre-creation state observed in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 represents an absence of function, not an absence of material. And maybe to try and give you an illustration of that, if we had a car, we all know what the function of a car is. The function of a car is to transport people from position A to position B. If you remove the fuel or maybe the engine or the wheels and where else, the car still exists. It's still materially there. You can see it and touch it, but it no longer functions. It's not able to perform as a car should. But the car is actually there. And it's the same way that we're looking in this particular example. So while the Jews believed that God was the ultimate creator of all that existed, as we do, so in other words, God created, as generally believed, out of nothing. In a way, it is out of nothing because nothing existed beforehand. But in a way, God's creating it out of Himself, out of His own energy via Einstein's E equals mc squared. God is creating all the material, the atoms, us as we stand here today. And the Judaistic understanding of creation in Genesis chapter 1, as written by Moses for them and ultimately for us as human beings, represented an activity of bringing functionality to a non-functional condition rather than bringing material substance to a situation in which matter was absent. And that's quite a kind of concept, but again, it's this idea of, if you look at the car, it's about putting the petrol into the car so that it can function as a car and drive people. The car was always there. It just wasn't able to work without the petrol or the tires or the engine. So when we come to Bohu, having looked at Tohu, as we said, Bohu only occurs 3 times in the Old Testament and always in close proximity to Tohu. And so it means that which is empty, to some degree, a kind of like a vacuum, but a vacuum of sort of function and form and stuff, and a kind of uninhabited area. And that picture really, I think, probably sums up the idea of Bohu. When you look at that sort of desert landscape, I mean, it's just empty. It's devoid of anything that has any value or function. There's no farms there. There's no plants. There's no orchards. There's no fences. There's no boundaries. There's no streams, water, irrigation, buildings, people, animals. There's just nothing. I mean, it's just absolutely useless. And if you stayed there for a while, it probably would change. It's just this continual repeated slipping and sliding and changing. As the wind blows those sand dunes, they recreate it in a different form probably the next day or whenever a strong wind comes by. And so you can very easily get disorientated out there because there's no fixed landmarks. There's just absolutely nothing in this uninhabited area. At most, you're going to find a couple of rocks, maybe some scrubby little bush or something that you can't use or eat, maybe some scorpions, spiders, lizards, but I mean, just really absolutely useless. Nobody would want to buy that. And so we find in these 3 occurrences of Bohu, as I said, with Tohu, Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, which we looked at, Jeremiah 4, verse 23, and Isaiah 34, verse 11. And what they say is that this Tohu or Bohu is a hendiadys. And I don't know if you've sort of heard of the word hendiadys, but it really means, by definition, one by means of 2 or a 1 and 2 words. So it's where you're taking 2 kind of different words, joining them together to create, in a way, a different meaning and word out of those 2. So you might have policeman, police being the functioning thing that should be out there catching thieves and robbers. We know that doesn't quite happen here. But you've got the police and then you've got a man. You bring them together and we get the policeman, the guy who actually should be out there catching robbers, etc. We take country and western, country being out in the country somewhere away from an urban area, western being the other side of eastern, I guess. You bring it together and you get a genre of music, country and western. Bestseller, or even a fire engine. Have you got fire? We know fire is a flame, and engine is some form of motor. You bring it together and you get a fire engine. That's a truck that goes out to put out fires. So again, bringing together 2 different words, pulling them together and creating a generalized concept of something slightly different. And so Tohu Bohu means if I'm stuck here, means a formless emptiness, as we kind of looked at, or almost like an empty chaos. And when we saw with that desert, we can just imagine those sand dunes shifting and changing at the whim of the wind. And sometimes when Tohu occurs without Bohu, and we do find that occasionally as we go through the Old Testament, it simply means Tohu Bohu as well. So in other words, it carries the same kind of meaning. And just 2 examples there. From Job chapter 6 and verse 18, the waste or the wasteland that we read about and Job is describing. He's talking here about these wadis, these dry creek beds or river beds that had no water in them. And if you think about a wadi or this dry river bed in a desert, what's the purpose of the thing? It's just really some form of meandering furrow in the desert. It has no benefit to anybody. There's no water in it to feed animals, to irrigate plants, etc. It's just an absolute waste in this particular wasteland. Likewise, in Deuteronomy 32, verse 10, as the children of Israel being taken out of Egypt and taken through the wilderness, we read there the desert land and in the waste, and it's this word tohu of the wilderness. And so they wandered through this kind of real wasteland, somewhere where you didn't want to drop anchor and roots and start trying to plant or do anything. And so God has this massive contrast between what he took them through compared to the promised land that he held out for them at the end of the journey. So just going back to Genesis chapter 1, the first occurrence of this Tohu Bohu, we saw there the earth was without form and void, darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters. And this is not, this Tohu Bohu is not, as I've said before, a simple nothingness. This is not a vacuum in outer space. If we go into space, there's absolutely nothing there. There's no atoms, there's nothing. I mean, it's just inhospitable and you can't live there. So it's not talking about a vacuum in outer space. The earth exists. It's materially there. It's just non-functional. So we have to think the way those in the Middle East and the Jews and the Arabs, but particularly the Jews in this case, viewed things. And their view was rather of a useless piece of land, a barrenness in which nothing of value could grow. You couldn't grow crops and orchards and vineyards. It was a stretch of land without any order. So you think again about farmlands. I mean, when you fly over farmlands and look at them or drive past them, we see this ordered structure. There's fields, they're clearly marked out. There's fences, there's irrigation lines, there's crops planted in specific rows. Guys might be plowing and there's straight lines, etc. In this particular case, again, there's no fixed landmarks. There's nothing to really put your finger on to identify where you are. There's no set patterns in terms of what you're looking at. There's no discernible life. So that's the way the Jews and the people in the Middle East viewed this kind of Tohu Bohu. And so the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And this Hebrew word here for is really describing a devoted bird brooding or sheltering her young. It's kind of like that eagle that you see there. So that mother eagle hovering over that nest, sheltering and protecting with its wings out, protecting its young and guarding over them. And God gives us a further example in Deuteronomy 32, verses 9 to 11, of this exact example. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage. He found him in a desert land and in the howling waste, that Tohu of the wilderness. He encircled him, he cared for him, he kept him as the apple of his eye. And like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that flutters over its young, spreading out its wings, catching them, bearing them on its pinions. So that's really the concept that God's trying to bring across to us, of this idea of how he was back in that beginning, as he slowly changed the form, I guess, almost of the earth at that time and made it functional for man. And so carrying on with Genesis, we carry on in verses 3 to 5, we read there, and God said, let there be light, and there was light, and God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And that was the evening and the morning of the first day. And so what we find here when we look at what God's doing to the earth here is this particular sequence. So A, B, and C, as I've put them there, we've got this formlessness, the tohu, we've got the emptiness, the bohu, and we've got the darkness. That's the order that it's presented to us. So it existed, but there was no function. You can't do anything if it's formless. You can't do anything if it's empty. You can't do anything if it's dark. And then at God's command, we see he reverses the sequence, and it becomes bright with light in verses 3 to 5. It becomes full of vegetation in verses 11 to 12. And then later on, he actually fills it also with animal life and of every imaginable kind. And then it becomes well ordered. And you just have to look at the regularity and the precise nature of the lights in the sky and the seasons, and there to mark out days, months, years, etc. And so we see this exact opposite. Where it was formless, empty, and dark, it's now the opposite round. It's now bright, no longer dark. It's now full, no longer empty. It's now well ordered, no longer formless and unstructured. And then God rounds it off that it was all good. So here's really the essence of God's creative act. It's an earth full with life and regulated and controlled by God's hand. And over this newly filled and ordered world, God placed his greatest and the most important single creation, and that was man and woman. So everything God had done up to this point was in preparation for man and woman. And so we read, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth. And remember, up until at this point, it had just been empty. It was empty and formless. So fill the earth and subdue it. And what does subdue imply? Subdue implies that you're going to go about bringing order and structure to what until that point had now just been chaotic. So God's instructions to man, and in having prepared all of this for him and then putting him in place, is to go out and be fruitful, fill this world, obviously with people who will bring him glory, and subdue it. And subdue it is not just the world itself. Subdue your own nature, so that your nature is in subjection to you, that you can worship and glorify God properly. I'm going to look now at the second occurrence, and that's in Jeremiah chapter 4 and verse 23. And look here at the contrast in the change in how Jeremiah depicts the land of Israel. And he's talking here, when you read the context, not of the earth as a whole, but specifically of the land of Israel. And I looked on the earth, this is the land of Israel, and behold, it was without form and void. So again, that Tohu Bohu, and to the heavens, and they had no light. And I looked, and behold, the fruitful land was a desert, and all its cities were laid in ruins before the Lord, before his fierce anger. And so we see as we move into verse 26 this change in terms of what's taken place. There we had these fruitful lands. So the land of Israel was fruitful. That's what God had brought them out of Egypt and into, and what he had promised them as the promised land. And fruitful land implies that there's order, there's structure, there's farming, there's plowed fields, there's fences, there's planning, there's irrigation. And all that had now become just a desert, what we had seen before. And cities, again, what do cities imply? Also structure, design, planning, architecture, streets, roads, meaning. And now it's just rubble and ruins. And so we see this kind of reversal. And so God, in giving his people order and peace when they came into the land, the purpose of giving them that was so that they could glorify him. And how had the children of Israel responded to God's grace and his mercy in giving them all of these things? Well, God says to us, my people are fools. They do not know me. They are senseless children. They have no understanding. They are skilled in doing evil. They know not how to do good. And so coming back to verse 23 with all this in mind, we I think now begin to better understand what Jeremiah is trying to say to us. And so we read in verses 23 to 25, I looked on the earth, and behold, it was without form, Tohu, and void, Bohu, and to the heavens, and they had no light. And again, you see this reversal of Genesis chapter 1, verse 4. I looked on the mountains, and behold, they were quaking, and the hills moved to and fro. I looked, and behold, and there was no man, and all the birds of the air had fled. So everything we saw God creating and forming and doing in Genesis, God is just reversing it here because of the way the children of Israel responded to him. And so now there's no longer man. There's no longer birds in the air. Everything is without form and void. And then our third and last occurrence of Tohu Bohu is Isaiah 34 and verse 11. And in this particular chapter of chapter 34, what we find here is Isaiah spelling out to us how God goes about bringing this terrible, terrible judgment upon Edom. And so we read there, God again going about this process of undoing all of that creative work that we found him doing in Genesis. And so we find that those fertile lands that are spelt out for us in Isaiah 34 with crops and animals, all for food for man, suddenly all of those things are gone. The ordered and inhabited cities with their towns and roads and planning, etc., all gone as well. So again, this reversal taking place. And what's interesting is to look at what remains. And so we read in verse 9, there's just pitch and tar. What can you do with pitch or tar other than make a road in this day and age? Verse 9 as well, sulfur. I mean, what can you do with sulfur? It's just this yellow rubbish. Smoke in verse 10. Confusion and emptiness, verse 11. Nettles and thistles in verse 13. Nothing that you can eat out of nettles and thistles. And then in terms of animals, just jackals and wild desert animals. So again, in every step of the way, we see God reverting back to something just deserty and waste and useless and something that can't be used. And so we read our key verse here, verse 11. God shall stretch out the line of confusion, this tohu, over it, and the plumb line of emptiness. this Bohu. And so we see, once again, God reversing this process as a judgment. But we know from Paul's words in 1 Corinthians that we must first have that which is natural, then that which is spiritual. So we see this time and time again in Scripture where God gives us something in a natural form, and obviously we expect it to either read into that or see in that a spiritual component. And so what's true of God's natural creation is especially true of God's spiritual creation also, and that being Israel. And so in God's natural creation, we saw how he went about bringing light out of darkness, how he brought order out of chaos, how he brought abundant life out of stillness and emptiness. And so in God's spiritual creation, Israel, we find here, what does God do? He calls this wild, disorganized slave people, just a bunch of rebel people living in Egypt, a people who hardly knew who they believed anymore. They no longer circumcised their children. They hardly knew who God was. They'd been in Egypt for 210 years. Joseph had long since died, and Jacob and all those other sort of older brothers, etc., they'd long since died. And so they'd slowly begun to lose their way as they incorporated into their way of life and probably a lot of their beliefs, the beliefs and cultures and things of Egypt and surrounding nations. And so God goes in there and rescues them with Moses and leads them out of Egypt through the desert. In the desert where there's no water and anything like that, God goes about feeding them and watering them, providing the things that they need. He shelters and protects them, not just from the elements in the desert, but also from all those surrounding nations who were living in fear of this huge group of people going through the desert. And God protected them from that. God showed them his glory. He built a tabernacle in the midst of them, this rectangular structure, and carefully placed in order around that structure the different tribes in different sections with this particular order. And he gave them laws and statutes and ordinances. And so in God's spiritual creation, when we get down into this detail, he gives them the exact directions and ways and methods as to how they were to go about worshiping him. He gives them instructions as to which days and at what time they might come before him to offer specific sacrifices. For the priests and the Levites, he says what clothes and garments they need to wear to perform the act of being a priest and serving before God. He gives them the precise measurements of the ingredients for all the incense and the anointing oil and the things that they were to use. He gives them a preparation schedule, that the exact time of that they must carry out their sacrifices, and the manner of consuming their Passover lambs. And so all of these instructions and guidelines were there to do what? They were there to sanctify his people, to separate them from the world and its ways. In the surrounding nations around them, people were just worshipping this god and that god, this devil, that demon, whatever it might have been, a whole host of gods. They had all sorts of different practices, sacrificing their kids, absolute chaos in the way that they carried out their lives and they worshipped. And so God gave them order and structure to dedicate them to worship him as his covenant people, his special possession, where he would be their father and they would be his children. God didn't want to be a god to them, where they were just a sort of slave people who worshipped him out of fear because he was all-powerful and a god. God wanted an intimate relationship. He wanted to be their father, and he wanted them to be his children. Such a different mindset when we look at so many of the religions in the world today, where the God that people worship is a God who's there's just no connection, no touch, no feeling. They don't have a father like we have. And under his hovering wings, which we looked at, they would find what? They would find rest, they would find mercy, they would find peace, comfort, safety. All of those things God was offering them. And if you think about it, God's laws were never burdensome and unpleasant. They were there for what purpose? To guide and to teach and to instruct and to make their lives better, so that they didn't have to live some pointless, chaotic and meaningless life. That's what God's laws were there for. And perhaps they weren't, in inverted commas, free as they had been in that howling waste wilderness of Sinai. But what did that really mean, to be free? in Sinai. That they were no longer free to live out what? Some sad and confused and bewildered existence with no hope? Is that freedom? We can look at a beggar when we go up to a robot or a stop sign, and we can see a beggar sitting in the gutter with a torn cup begging for sort of money. Is that beggar free? Technically he is. He's not bound in jail or something like that. But he's everything but free. He's bound by his poverty. He's bound by maybe his lack of education. He's bound by the circumstances that have got him into that thing, whether it's drugs or alcohol, bound by sort of maybe some poor family upbringing, whatever his circumstances might be. They are bounding him as much as chains are binding you in prison. He's not free. And nor can you be out in the world without God. So when we move to the New Testament and have a look at this concept of Tohu Bohu, we find here in the New Testament that in Jesus, God is providing for us a remedy for our chaotic emptiness of a worldly life. For those who have come from outside, who maybe didn't grow up in the meeting in Christadelphia, you'd have to look at the life that you were exposed to and led in that chaotic emptiness without God, without the understanding, without the knowledge of Him and His Son. And if we really want to, I think, grasp that concept of what it's like to be out there, we only need to look at an amazing example of this particular man who best illustrates and demonstrates to us what it is like to be out in the world. And he called himself Legion. Legion because he imagined himself being inhabited by thousands of demons. And what do we say is wrong with him? He wasn't possessed by demons. It's what he thought was going on in his head. But he was schizophrenic. He had thousands of personalities raging around in his head. And one day he was this, and the next moment he was that, sometimes violent, sometimes kind, sometimes nice, sometimes angry, sometimes whatever his personality was. All of this raging around in his head, chaos in his head. His mind was confused, disorientated with this absolute madness inside him. His life had to have been a living hell. And as a consequence of his actions and the way he performed, etc., through no fault of his own, he was despised, he was rejected, he was feared, he was hated. And because he could sometimes harm them in particular states that he found, they tried to bind him and put chains on them, which he broke. And he barely survived. Nobody was looking after him. Nobody cared about him. He was naked. He would tear his clothes off. He lived amongst tombs and graves with dead bodies. And this example is given us as a living parable to depict what it is like to live out in the world there without God and without Jesus. This is Legion. This is the life you'll live out there. And how did his life change? Well, his life changed when he met Jesus. And so it will be for those who come from outside and meet Jesus. And so what do we see with Legion having met Jesus? How did his life change? Well, the next time we see him, he's sitting there clothed. He's sitting in his right mind. He's no longer having his head full of all these different personalities. He's got one mind, and it's clear and it's understanding. He's sitting at the feet of Jesus, and he's listening to the words of Jesus. And we look at that and say, what a contrast. And so what are we being offered here? This is what God is offering to everybody out there in the world. Come out of that chaos, that Legion life, and come and sit at the feet of Jesus and listen to him. And so what an amazing story or parable, living parable of life in or outside a relationship with God and with Jesus. And then we can go and look at Tohu Bohu in a different particular church. And so the first one we're going to look at is the Ephesian ecclesia or church, and we pick up detail on that in the letter, the epistle that Paul writes to the Ephesians, and he writes to them about people like that insane Legion. Gentiles who had been separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of promise, without hope and without God in the world. So here he's summarizing what it's like to be Legion, without hope in the world. And And Paul tells them where once they had been separate, they are now brought near in verse 13. Where they had once been excluded from God's family, they are now reconciled to God in verse 16. Where they had once been foreigners, they are now fellow citizens with God's people. Where they had once been without hope, they are now built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets and the hope that they had. Where they had once been without God, they now have access to Him through Christ's blood into His presence. And so their lives of empty chaos they've been saved by the gift of grace, of God's grace, through faith. They have been created in Christ Jesus. And the good works required from them are anything but onerous, because they are joyfully and willingly done, as they are the very means by which God continues to work with them and with us. And they are His workmanship. And in their partnership and relationship with God, with their Creator, they do their part to prepare themselves for His new, glorious, everlasting creation in the kingdom. And so what do we see? We see this incredibly clear transition taking place from this darkness that they were in to light, from death to life, from emptiness and desolation to fullness and fruitfulness, from chaos and confusion to meaning and purpose. That's what God holds out to everybody. We can go to another church, the Corinthian ecclesia, and again we find Paul writing to them, and he's replying to aspects that were happening within their particular meeting and where things were going wrong for them. And he's addressing this issue of where they're worrying and agonizing over ecclesial rules and constraints that these rules that they have are bringing upon them. And he addresses them about how they become overly concerned about their right to be able to exercise their freedom in Christ, even if it caused others to stumble. Their rights were more important. And so it was an inward looking about self that they were concerned about. He addresses them being obsessed with the freedom to enjoy themselves in certain activities, whether or not it was expedient or beneficial to others. They just didn't care about others. It was more about them enjoying themselves. And he addresses them about being concerned about expressing their own individuality in various forms of worship, even if it had no value or encouragement or comfort to anyone else. Again, just inward looking, inward thinking, not caring about the others around them. And so Paul says, whatever is done or not done, so sometimes it might be both done or not done, whatever is done or not done must be done out of love. Has to be done or not done by your concern and your care and your love for those in your particular church or meeting. And he goes on to say to us, God is not a God of confusion. And think again of this chaos, this disorder, this tohu that we've been looking at. But God is a God of peace. And in verse 40, but all things should be done decently and in order, not in a chaotic manner, not in a way that brings people down. And so again, we see this concept, everything but tohu bohu. What about Tohu Bohu in our own personal lives? We've looked at the Old Testament, we've looked at Legion, we've looked at examples of different churches in the New Testament. Well, as followers of Christ, we have to put aside in our own personal lives the Tohu Bohu and develop within ourselves a regular, well-organized life that will always show God glory and bring God glory. That's what God wants from us. And how do we go about doing this? How do we bring about this regular, well-organized life within ourselves? Well, just here's a couple of examples. We go about by developing a life of routine and good habits. And this is not an exhaustive list, it's just a couple of things jotted down. But we go about by reading our Bible on a regular basis, because therein we're going to find the knowledge of God and of Jesus and what His plans are, where the world is going, and understand that it's not chaotic like people think it is out there. God has a plan and a purpose. We develop routine and good habits by supporting ecclesial activities, coming to meetings, whatever they might be. If we have a particular function on a particular night or a day, we should be there, coming to those particular activities. We attend memorial meetings on a consistent basis. On every Sunday we're here like we are today, coming here to remember Jesus and the bread and the wine. A good routine and an extremely good habit, and one we commanded to do. We do so by praying, both privately, at our own homes, for example, behind the wheel of a car, wherever you might be, and also collectively, like we've done today. By just supporting the weekly Bible classes. People have prepared talks, etc., and done those things to not just for themselves, but to assist people, and we should be there supporting them so that we can also learn from the things that they've put effort into. We do so by instructing our children, trying to teach them the same things we know and we value and we understand, so that they might too grow up and know the God that we worship. And we go about seeking out how we can be of practical help to others. And that's both inside this meeting and outside. How can we help other people? And so we read from Luke's words in Acts chapter 2 and verse 42 of a whole bunch of people who were baptized. And what does Luke tell us? He says they continued steadfastly. Steadfastly means routine. They were doing this on a regular basis. So they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship and in breaking of bread and in prayers. 4 things that they were doing and in effect commanded or told to do. And I think we can liken it to a table, as you see on up there, with 4 legs. Those 4 legs representing doctrine, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayers. And what happens if you take a 4-legged table and chop one leg off? It falls over. It can't stand on 3 legs. It's not designed to do that. It needs all 4 to be stable. And so it is with these things. You can't pick and choose which one you're going to decide to leave out or not do. We need to do all of these things. And so in our doctrine, when we look at that and go back to some of that list that I've done earlier, where do we get our doctrine from? Obviously listening to talks, Bible classes, etc., but also by reading our Bible on a regular basis. There's our doctrine. By supporting ecclesial activities, there's our fellowship. One of the big problems and it's not so pertinent here in South Africa, but definitely overseas, is that people have got so comfortable and used to watching their church meetings on Zoom, they don't want to come back to the meeting anymore. They're quite happy to sit there, still in their pajamas with a cup of coffee and not having to get into the car. It's comfortable and easy to do that from home. But that's not what Luke's telling us here. We have to fellowship. Fellowship means not sitting on the other side of a TV screen or a computer screen. It means coming here and being with your brethren and sisters. Why do we do that? Why is fellowship such an important, one of these fundamental legs of this table? It's because we as individuals benefit from that interaction with our brothers and sisters. They give us comfort, instruction, guidance, help when we're in trouble. But it's not a one-sided thing. We also likewise do the same thing for when a brother or sister needs a shoulder to cry on, needs advice, needs help. We can't do that on the other side of a computer screen. And we have the breaking of bread and prayers. All of these critical functions listed out in Acts. But this is not some checklist to be ticked off. We can't be saved, we're told, by works, but only by our faith. But, as we very clearly told, faith must express itself by what we do. So our faith is manifest in various works that we do. No matter how big or small they are we doing all that we can for the kingdom of God on earth? Are we helping prepare others for this kingdom? Are we preparing ourselves for Christ's return? Because all of these simple habits that we've looked at and processes that we do each day keep our minds and our hearts close to God. And in developing these good habits in our lives that we've looked at, we become like sheep that follow the Good Shepherd. And after all, He is the one who protects us. He is the one who guides us. We can't do it ourselves, not in this world. And if we stay close to Him and avoid straying off after our own selfish pursuits, then our lives will become ordered. They will become structured. We'll be at peace beside His still waters, where we are comforted, where we can lie down in green pastures. And if we stay close to God, to the Good Shepherd, we will not wander away into the nearby wilderness, because what's out there in the wilderness? Chaos, nothingness, confusion, fear, despair, no hope. That's what's out there. And we can see about this. Jesus spoke about it in Luke 21, that there will be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars and on the earth. And he's talking about the time just before he returns, which is kind of round about now. Distress of nations. We only have to look out there and see how people are stressed about Russia and Ukraine and what's coming on the earth. In perplexity because of the roaring of the sea and the waves. People fainting with fear and with foreboding of what is coming on the world. For the powers of heaven will be shaken. That's the world we live in. Distress, perplexity, fainting, fear, foreboding, chaos. And so if we're out there in the world, away from the Good Shepherd, that's where we will be attacked by lions and wolves. And so as sheep, let us listen to the shepherd's voice. Let us follow that voice wherever it leads us. Because that voice will lead us to a place of order and peace and rest.